We can't talk about the prison-industrial complex and the problem of mass incarceration unless we also talk about the war on drugs. In The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander details how banning drugs has always been a method of controlling certain groups of people. Opium was originally banned because of its association with opium dens and Chinese immigrants. The backlash against Chinese immigrants included banning opium. The first marijuana bans were passed for similar reasons, except for stereotypes about Mexican migrants in the early 1900s. In the 1980s and 90s, the fear of the so-called crack epidemic was fueled almost entirely by stereotypes about poor black people. Even though crack cocaine is no more dangerous than regular cocaine, crack-related crimes are punished with sentences 10 times longer than regular cocaine. All of this has to be viewed in the face of the fact that there is no evidence that non-white people use drugs any more than white people. President Nixon declared a war on drugs in 1971. He dramatically increased the size and presence of federal drug control agencies. Mandatory sentencing for drug crimes were also instituted at this time. In the 1980s, the Reagan administration further expanded the war on drugs, contributing massively to the rise in incarceration rates. Politicians at this time realized that campaigning as being hard on drug crime was a successful strategy to being elected. Once these politicians were in office, they passed tougher drug laws, leading to stricter controls and longer sentences. This led to a vicious cycle of ever-increasing sentences for drug-related crimes. The anti-drug hysteria of the 80s and 90s has trained most people in the United States to think that people who use drugs are criminals and must be locked up. The drug war is a huge component of the reality of mass incarceration, but it hasn't been to crack down on the so-called harder drugs. In the 90s, marijuana possession arrests accounted for nearly 80% of the overall growth in drug arrests. In 2012, 1.5 million people were arrested for non-violent drug charges. Nearly half of these were for marijuana law violations only. One of the myths of the drug war is that the government is going after the system of distribution, or after the kingpins. But of all the marijuana arrests in 2012, 81% of those were for possession only. So the war on drugs is not going after the people at the top, nor is it really going after the so-called hard drugs. Instead, regular, everyday, non-violent people are being criminalized for what ought to be looked at as a health issue. A recent study looked at the damage that drugs can actually do. The study looked at both the physical and social harm that an individual drug can actually cause. Here are the results. Perhaps unsurprisingly, alcohol does the most damage, both physically and socially. It causes more harm than crack, heroin, and meth. So the drug war is not about protecting people from themselves. If it were, alcohol would not be so easy to obtain. But because it is so socially acceptable, alcohol remains legal, even though it causes serious physical and social harm. If the war on drugs was actually about health issues, then needle exchange programs would not be shot down at every possible corner. Approximately 1/3 of all AIDS cases is due to sharing needles. The Center for Disease Control found that needle exchange or syringe access programs lowers HIV incidence by 80%. But Congress banned any federal support for these kinds of programs. One common defense of the drug war is that drug dealers just do so much harm. But we already know that doing drugs is less harmful than using alcohol. Violence is associated with almost any kind of black market activity. But we already have laws criminalizing violence. If one drug dealer shoots another drug dealer, we can just charge them for murder. We do not need special drug crimes to solve this problem. It's pretty well documented how racist the war on drugs is. It's also important to remember that most of the drugs that we think of as bad also have a legal counterpart. If you have a doctor and a good healthcare plan, most of these drugs are available with a prescription. For people who just need a little bit of help getting through the day, if you can afford a prescription, then you're okay. If you have to self-medicate, on the other hand, you're labeled as a criminal. Some states have started to realize that the war on drugs is a seriously misled effort. 23 states plus the District of Columbia have now legalized marijuana in some form. 4 of those states have legalized pot for recreational use. DC has also voted to decriminalize marijuana, but the recent congressional budget bill has blocked that effort. Unfortunately, Congress gets to review laws passed in the district. It's time to realize that the war on drugs has failed. Treating drug users like criminals only fuels the black market, and putting drug addicts into prison just causes further harm.